Hello, everyone. So, today we will be diving into a topic that's more relevant than ever before. News moves fast, but your financial plan shouldn't. I'm your host, Shravani, and to explore this, I'm joined by a founder and CEO, Mr. Vishal Dhawan. Hello, Vishal.
Hi.
So let's get right into this. We always keep seeing these constant headlines about news, tariffs, and constant market crashes. So, in this noisy environment, we see so much anxiety and fear among investors regarding the volatility that they are seeing in their investments and their portfolios. So, do you think the sudden reaction to these headlines does it actually hurt or actually benefit your portfolio in the longer term?
So I think it's a very important question that you ask because I think the number of market crashes that get talked about are significantly more than the number of market crashes that actually happening. Uh, in fact, if you look at hypothetically the last few months, let's say you for some reason went into hibernation in September of 24 and you now wake up suddenly in June or July of 2025 and look at what all has happened in markets. You'll be surprised to know that things are pretty much where they were in September. But in the interim, there has been so much news flow. You had a US election, you had trade tariff wars getting announced, you've had a India UK free trade agreement come into place. There's been a lot of things that have been happening. But the end impact of all of that on portfolios has probably been very marginal. And therefore, there is a tendency very often to over analyze and overthink the impact of each of these changes. So one of the things that we always suggest to investors is that, if you are going to react to every piece of news, you need to be very, very mindful that in all likelihood, you're taking a view that this news is going to move in a certain direction going forward as well. And the challenge around news flow is that you could see a piece of news one day say something and a piece of news saying exactly the opposite the next day. And this is a bit like research on health. You will find someday that, having 2 cups of coffee is fantastic for your metabolism. And then you will read another research which tells you that, coffee is really bad for your health. So if you try to change your coffee consumption patterns on the basis of daily movement of how news is coming in about research on coffee, you'll probably be so confused that you either just junk all of it or you just have 6 cups of coffee. So typically the way we look at it is your financial plan, your investment strategy. All that needs to be mindful that too much of reaction to news is actually detrimenting to your overall process. Besides the fact that there will often be taxes and transaction costs on top of that you have to deal. Our experience over the years has been the best way to deal with all of this is to have a robust financial plan, which actually maps out your journey of what is the kind of life goals that you have and at what stages do you actually require money.
Thank you for bringing financial plans. Actually, my follow up question would be how often should investors look at changing or revisiting their financial plan?
So typically there are 3 big components in a financial plan. One part of it is really your plan B, which is essentially emergency funds. What if you lost your job? What if there was a health situation in your family that you have to deal with? It's really trying to figure out what happens when things go wrong for you. And there's also the risk management part as a part of this first bucket, which is looking at all your pieces of insurance, for example, life adequacy, health insurance adequacy, disability covers, maybe cyber insurance in the way that it is now looked at, etc. And what you want to be able to do is try to ensure that in the first bucket, you have a robust plan B available so that in case plan B actually hits your life and your family, you don't end up panicking and reacting. Because very often, you might find that the news flow at the same time as this plan B is coming into place may actually make you very anxious and want to change things in a portfolio where it may or may not be necessary. The second thing you want to think about in your financial plan is what are my short-term requirements of money? Essentially, what are my short-term goals? Now, the short-term goals could be travel, for example, or you could have a child going to college, so, or you could be in the process of paying for an under construction property for which you need to keep allocating capital. And that capital allocation is not compromisable because there's a time frame which is short in which you need to continue to make payments for that. The third bucket, which is a very, very important bucket, is your long-term bucket. This is supporting your long-term goals. Maybe you want to retire in a certain place. Maybe you want to retire with a certain amount of money so that you can afford a certain type of lifestyle. Maybe you want to travel a lot post your retirement. So different individuals in different families could have different goals that they're trying to plan for from a longer term perspective. And therefore, what ends up happening is when you have a robust financial plan, you know that because I have a plan B, because I have well-defined short-term goals, and I have well-defined long-term goals, I can now decide how I want to react to each of these pieces of news that actually comes. For example, if there is a short-term impact news item which might come in, does it really need me to worry about the money that I'm putting away for retirement? Because that's a long-term goal. And this volatility in stock markets on the basis of news flow may disappear. But if the same money was kept aside for short-term goals, I might have to react to that news because I need that money in the short term and may not have time available for it. COVID is a fantastic example of what can happen. No. It just seems that if we distant town, but not too many years ago, there was clearly a very sharp correction that happened across global assets. And obviously at that point in time, it appeared like the best strategy to put into place was to actually go ahead and liquidate your portfolio because it looked like no one was going to survive. And very quickly, we saw how things turned around. We saw how vaccination came in. We saw how government stepped in. We saw how federal banks, central banks stepped in, etc. And all of a sudden, you could see that there was a clear alternative which was available. And because a clear alternative was available, and as human beings, we all adapted, we reached a point where stock markets had some of the best bull runs that ever happened. So the news flow was saying something else. The asset class behavior was very different because liquidity came in and held out.
Understood, yeah. So now that the financial plan we've established, it should be changed. So how does this frequency of changing or revisiting your financial plan, how does it affect your investments?
So typically what ends up happening is that we suggest most times that investors look at their financial plan once a year. Because what happens is that typically your goals start to become clearer each year once you've done a financial plan. And of course, there are some changes that happen during the year which may require you to revisit it. For example, you may have the thought that instead of being salaried, you want to become an entrepreneur. Now that thought for it to germinate will normally take a little bit of time. It doesn't happen overnight. So what you then end up doing is when you do your next plan after a year, you revisit it. Of course, there will be certain times when you might choose to do this faster. For example, there is a sudden job loss that happens. When you have a sudden job loss that happens, even though you may have had a plan B, you might want to go back and revisit everything to just be sure that things are in place, which are robust. You might have a child who has always said that they want to study domestically, suddenly come to you one day and say, I'd like to get international exposure. Now that could have a big impact in terms of the kind of requirements of money that you might have. And therefore, your plan may have to undergo a change. Now, your investment strategy typically is a function of your financial plan. Because let's say if the education that we're referring to, the sudden shift from domestic to international, is in the near term, it may mean that some of your assets that today were kept away for longer term goals like retirement may have to be got into the shorter term bucket, because you might need to actually use that money to support the international education. And therefore, you may have thought that this money is required after 10 years, and therefore it's lying in equity. But you might suddenly realize how much required in 1-2 years. And therefore, investment strategy is changing because the goals are changing. Of course, we do not recommend that people pull money out of a retirement basket and put it into an education basket, because there are other ways to support the education as well, with scholarships, loans, etc. But it's an example of what can change. And therefore, your investment strategy may automatically end up shifting because you have your financial plan, which is undergone a change.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense now. So, what can individuals or investors actually do to avoid falling prey to such breaking news without actually breaking their financial plans? Because we see so many investors in turn they are taking wide actions and which really impact their portfolios. So, how can we avoid all of this?
So I think it's something that, unfortunately is a part of how behavior tends to be. And part of it is also about the risk tolerance that different investors may have. Because some of them may be very anxious when markets behave in a manner which they don't enjoy and overreact because of fear. And there may be other investors who are much more adventurous, and therefore they end up overreacting on the upside and start to get greedy in terms of the outcomes that can come through. So I think a very important part of this process is to actually um, zoom out and say that, okay, what does the 30,000 feet really view look like? Is it, you know, is it all murky from up here? Or are these just short term storms that might be passing through? And how do I ensure that what I do today does not impact my long term plans? Um, there is a study by Dalbar, which has been happening since 1983 in the US, which essentially shows that every year, when you look at data, the investors' returns are much lower than the returns of the product that they have bought, which is essentially called the investment returns. And this is happening because of the behavioral parts of what ends up happening, where there is too much of in and out that happens within portfolios, actually impacting longer term returns. The second thing that investors need to keep in mind is that there are biases that will typically exist amongst all of us. You have some biases, I have some biases, investors have some biases. By being conscious about these biases and being aware about these biases and stepping back and not reacting immediately, you do end up seeing very often that a lot of this can be controlled. In fact, very often you will see that even speaking to a spouse, for example, where the entire picture is explained once again, works very well, because when you make this decision in a zone where you sort of keep yourself out from all the noise, you're likely to make a much better decision. The third thing that you need to keep in mind is that uh, your only real friend, or as Markowitz says, your only real free lunch is asset allocation, which means that you need to put your money into multiple asset classes and not have all your money in one asset class only. There is a desire at different points in time to have most of your money in one particular asset class. So, for example, if you've had a great experience with real estate, or your family has made a lot of money with real estate, we often see that your portfolio will have a lot of real estate. And the more it does better, the more fresh money also you put it there, which means you're increasing risk of having accidents, which can be avoided. The same thing with equities. For investors who are very positive on equities, or whose families have been investing in equities for a long while, you might find that they have no money in any other asset class at all because of this reason. And then when equities fall, they find that they have to sell equities even in extreme situations, which are actually times to buy rather than sell. But unfortunately, they have no liquidity to make that happen. The third thing is that you have to think about how you can automate your investment strategies to a great extent. And these could be automation of your regular investments, where you start to say that, I'm going to put away a certain amount of money every month or every quarter. You now have instruments like SIPs, or you've always had things like recurring deposits in banks. We just forced you to invest on a regular basis. You look at, how do you automate your retirement savings? Because what ends up happening is that if you don't automate retirement savings, it's normally such a faraway goal that all other short-term goals will get precedence, and your retirement savings will go right back. And by the time you reach 45 or 50 or 55 and really start to look at that carefully, you might find that you don't have enough time on your side to really be able to take advantage of. So I think all in all, our sort of suggestion to investors is that don't overreact to news. Be aware. This doesn't mean don't read what is happening, don't listen to the news, don't do any other. But not every piece of information is worth acting upon. And therefore, the more you are able to stay away from that, and the more you are able to have this long-term plan, which has all these buckets that they spoke about in place, I think the more likely that your investment strategy will be stable, sound, and designed for better outcomes as compared to constantly moving in and out of different asset classes.
Okay, so that brings me to the end of this podcast. Thank you, Usha. Thank you so much for giving us such valuable insights. And thank you to the viewers as well. I hope you enjoyed this conversation and took out something from what we discussed now. And yeah, if you like this episode and enjoyed what we talk about, do consider subscribing to our YouTube channel. Thank you for spending time on this video. Thank you.
Disclaimers. Investments in securities market are subject to market risks. Read all the related documents carefully before investing. Registration granted by SEBI, membership of BUSL and certification from National Institute of Securities Markets, NISM, in no way guarantee performance of the intermediary or provide any assurance of returns to investors. The information is only for consumption by the client and such material should not be redistributed. The securities quoted are for illustration only and are not recommendatory. This material is for information and educational purposes only.